Good morning, and thank you so much to Amplify and to Annalie and Sally for that very kind introduction. Before I start today, I want to play a 3-minute film that was made for us by the people who made the Best Exotic Marigold Hotel. I'm sure some of you have seen that film. It's made for $10 million. It grossed $140 million, which I think is a glimpse of the market that's beginning to ripen with people in the second half of life. And it was part of a contest that they sponsored for 6 months. Each month, for that 6-month period, 5 people over the age of 50 who had an idea for changing the world received $5,000 to go from aspiration to action. And this film was made to promote that contest and this idea. So I hope you'll enjoy it.
If you're not growing, you're dying.
Hubie's basically the youngest person I know.
The status quo is unacceptable.
It's his vision and his ability to explain his vision to you. You can't help but be swept up in it.
Stasis is unacceptable.
He really paved the road for all of this, and I'll be forever indebted to him.
Let's just start, see what happens. Oh, 1, 2, 3, ready, and sing.
When the Boston Children's Chorus walks onto a stage, this very diverse choir singing at a level of excellence, Boston sees what it can become. My vision and my hope is that when these young people are 50 years of age, they look back on their experience and say, this was one of the most important experiences in my social development as a young person.
You know, collectively, how does risk-taking then play itself out in an everyday rehearsal situation? Not even just performance, but everyday rehearsal. Yeah.
Like in sight reading, you got to keep going. You got to sing with confidence, and if you don't take the risk of being wrong, you're definitely not going to sing the right note if you don't sing at all, you know?
Right, absolutely.
So even when you don't know, go.
A friend of mine he said, I'd like to nominate you for the Purpose Prize. The Purpose Prize provides an award for people who, in their Encore careers, in their so-called retirement years, continue to do important things that are of value to the society. I did receive the award in 2010, and it's very improbable. It was an improbable journey. Okay, I had tried other means to bring young people together, but nothing like this. I think the whole notion of retirement years and the way we used to think about it, actually doesn't make any sense. If you don't use your talents, your brains, and your body, you will go into atrophy. I often quote Marion Wright Edelman, the president of the Children's Defense Fund. Service is the rent we pay for living. A long time ago, I made the decision not to be a squatter on the land, but to pay my rent. That's what I do. I pay my rent.
"30 years ago, I traveled to the far northeast corner of the United States, to the state of Maine, to Portland, the capital of the state, or actually the largest city in the state, to the pediatrics ward of the Maine Medical Center, really the only good hospital in Maine. And I went there to see a group of older women who were working on that pediatrics ward 20 hours a week for a small stipend. And I went there not because I was old. I was in my mid-20s at the time. I was actually not even interested in older people. I was focused on young people. But research study after research study had come out in the United States showing that one of the most powerful ways to help young people who were growing up under difficult circumstances was through mentoring, was through a close, caring one-on-one relationship with an adult. And yet the biggest program in America, the Big Brother, Big Sister program, had a waiting list of kids that was half the size of the program. And it raised this question, where are we going to find the people to do those things that only human beings can do, especially as we learned how important those kinds of connections were? And if you think about that for any length of time, even 25 years ago, 30 years ago, before the full force of these demographic changes had started to wash over societies, the role of older people, this growing group, quickly comes to mind. And wondering how people could find greater meaning and purpose in that stage of life while filling some of the most important needs in the country. So I went to Portland because I heard about something that had been started in the 1960s, the foster grandparent program, which was placing low-income older women one-on-one with kids who were disabled, who were facing medical crises, who were disadvantaged. And there on that pediatrics ward, I met Aggie Bennett and Louise Casey. Aggie was the taller of the two. I don't know how it translates into meters, but she was 4'11". Louise was 4'10". Aggie had been a waitress her entire life. Louise had worked in a sawmill. They hadn't had particularly distinguished midlife careers. They tried retirement. It didn't agree with them. They were hardworking. They joined up to the foster grandparent program, which sent them to this ward. And the ward was filled with young people who were facing very significant challenges. There was the medical challenge, but there was also the social one, because Maine is a big state, a poor state. It was very common for the parents of these children to have to leave after a week or two to take care of their other children 4 or 5 hours away, to go back to their jobs because they couldn't afford to lose them. So you're 8 years old, you've got cancer, you're in an institutional setting, you're all alone. I mean, what kind of situation is that? And that's where Aggie and Louise came in. They basically became family to these kids. And at the time that I met them, they had already been doing it for over a decade. It had become a de facto 10-year second act for them. And while I was there during that period, one of the kids they were particularly close to passed away. And it forced me to just ask them honestly, because we had become close. They had actually started mentoring me. How can you do this in your golden years? You worked hard your entire lives. You earned a chance to get a break, and here you're in this situation confronting on a weekly basis great tragedy, and over again. And I remember Aggie looking at me with this quizzical expression and saying, "It's not a job, it's a joy." And in her mind, these kids had a limited amount of time on earth, and she and Louise had a limited amount of time on earth. What were they going to do during that period that meant something significant? And it reminded me of a line from the poet Marge Piercy, who wrote a poem, "To Be of Use." And she concludes the poem with this line. She said, "The pitcher cries for water to carry, and a person for work that is real." And I love that in conjunction with Aggie, since she was a waitress and she filled up a lot of pitchers in her life, and she filled up a lot of lives as well. And it also taught me another fundamental lesson, which is really everything that I want to impart today. A woman in the United States who founded a movement called the Gray Panthers, Maggie Kuhn, said, "We don't have a single person to waste." And you go to that pediatrics ward in Maine, and I'm sure it's the same thing today, and you realize in such a fundamental way that we can ill afford to write off the most experienced segment of the population, especially when they have so much to give in emotional terms and talent. And so I want to basically talk about purpose today, and I want to talk about societies that make full use of their human talent, of their human potential, of their population above a certain age as well as under it. And I want to tell you a little bit about my own personal pilgrimage too, because here we are in Sydney, and 25 years after I met Aggie and Louise, this very odd experience hit me. Maybe when Sally was talking about being selected to give this introduction due to age, well, I hit 50 myself, and I'd always thought of myself as this young guy who really honored older people, who believed in older people, and then all of a sudden my American Association of Retired Persons card arrived in the mail, and I realized I was them. And I had never anticipated that happening, certainly not happening so quickly. And I have to confess, after working hard for many decades, that my job was a joy, but it was also a job, and I was beginning to flag. And around the time I read a quote from the mythology expert, Joseph Campbell, who said, "Midlife is when you get to the top of the ladder and discover it's leaning against the wrong wall. And I decided the wall was actually fine, but the ladder was getting a little shaky. Margaret Mead's daughter, Mary Catherine Bateson, has written that we've stretched midlife so long that it's become like a run-on sentence in desperate need of punctuation. And I decided I needed some punctuation, not a comma, something more than that. A period was certainly out of the question. I had a 1-year-old and a 3-year-old at the time, so I wasn't anywhere close to being able to stop or even wanting to do that. I decided I needed a semicolon. And I didn't realize that, 50, you also have to go get that medical ritual too. So anything about a partial colon is probably not a great marketing ploy. But I decided to take a sabbatical. I had 3 months of vacation time. And where did I decide to go? Sydney, Australia. I got so excited about coming here. I collected just about every guidebook available in the United States at that time. We practically had a special storage unit to handle my acquisitions. And as the number of days before departure with my wife and our 1- and 3-year-old drew closer and my pile of guidebooks got higher, I realized I actually did not want to come to Sydney and spend 3 months in a hotel room with a screaming 1-year-old and 3-year-old. That was not a sabbatical. A sabbatical is what you did to recover from the 3 months in the hotel room. And so I did something radical. I called up the airlines and I told them I wanted to cash my tickets back in, and for a mere $1,000 they let me not come to Sydney. And instead of feeling hugely disappointed like I had missed my great opportunity in life, I was overcome with a sense of relief. And it's nothing against Sydney and nothing against Australia, but it turns out there's now a body of research in behavioral psychology that shows that one of the great sources of happiness in life is planning a fantastic vacation and then not going on it. No strip search at the airport, no 3 months of accumulated emails, not to mention the expense. So we canceled the trip, but I talked to my wife about this. We got to do something, so we decided to drive to the far northwest corner of the United States. I'd already 25 years ago been to the far northeast corner, a car trip to the Pacific Northwest, and I realized there was no way we were going to be able to do this in one day. So I started again travel planning, which is a bit of an obsession with me, and I found a motel in southern Oregon in the town that was about halfway between home and our destination. And I began negotiating to get the best deal I could possibly get because I'd already spent $1,000 not to come see all of you in Sydney. The weekend rate, the automobile discount, and then finally it hit me. I was a senior citizen. I got my AARP retirement senior citizen discount, say $14 in the room. I was so proud of my negotiating skills. I rushed out to tell my wife, who still remembered the $1,000 we paid not to go on the big worldwide trip. And she asked me, "You got the 2 cribs, right?" I had to call back, and the 18-year-old guy at the desk, this Marc Freedman, he said, "Yeah, Mr. Senior Citizen, can I have 2 cribs in the room?" And in that moment, I realized that I had joined a new category in society, the oxymoronic class, right? You've heard about neither young nor old, the working retired, the Walking Dead is probably, just a few steps off. But they're all of us flooding into our 50s, 60s, 70s, who really don't fit into midlife exactly. We're clearly not old. We're told that 60 is the new 40. You're supposed to cling to your fast-fading youth. At the same time, you get these senior citizen discounts at 50 or 60, so in some ways it's the old 80. At the same time, it's the new 40. It's either your fast-fading youth or premature aging. And this confusion at the individual level, I think, is reflected very much societally. The Treasury report has some inklings of it, right? The longevity revolution is one of the great triumphs of the last century. In the United States, we've extended life from 46 or 47 at the beginning of the last century to nearly 80. That's bigger than all the increases in all of human history leading up to 1900. That's something to celebrate, and we're supposed to continue to pursue this longevity goal, right? You go to the doctors and they don't say, you should really start smoking right away and cut out that exercise, and have you considered eating trans fats, right? They tell you to live right so that you can live long. Then you go home and you read the editorial page and you hear about this long gray wave of greedy geezers of which you realize you're part, that's soon going to be taking posterity to the cleaners, bankrupting future generations. It's almost as if the whole demographic transformation is brought to you by the disaster preparedness team, right? The age quake, the gray tsunami. I had this whole list of all of the different analogs. So the question really is how the best thing that ever happened to us as individuals, these longer, healthier lives that we're supposed to continue to augment, turns out to be the worst thing to happen to us as nations. And not only that, demography is destiny, right? These people are already born, the fate is already written. So how can that be? How can this longevity paradox be? So it's no wonder that you get satire in the United States by Christopher Buckley, the guy who wrote Thank You for Smoking, which proposes euthanasia for boomers at age 70. Or the Marigold Hotel, right? What's the premise of that movie? Outsourcing the elderly, right? So if we can't kill them off, we at least can get them to a different continent entirely. The whole premise that I want to throw out today is very much in line with the theme of Amplify, which is that the alternative to euthanasia and outsourcing is innovation. It's to completely redesign the nature of lives, and particularly the second half of life, in a way that fits this radical transformation in the length of lives, and particularly to invent a new stage of life between midlife and anything resembling old age, which sounds in a way blasphemous. Life stages seem like the oxygen in the air, natural phenomena, when in fact they're not fixtures but fictions. They're inventions to solve problems. They always have been, and that was something that I learned when I started studying the history of retirement in our country. And I want to say that the whole premise is that 60 is not the new 40, it's not the old 80, that 60 is the new 60, and that this transformation, this flood of people, 10,000 people a day in the United States turning 60 already, are something entirely new on the landscape. 50 years ago, when we invented the golden years, it was a solution to a problem. We had all these people who were described as too old to work, too young to die. They were in this anteroom to death, whiling away their time. It turned out it was a big problem for society, a big problem particularly for the insurance industry, which was having a hard time getting people to think about investing in this phase of life because it was a dreaded period when people were utterly rejected. And so the idea emerged. There was a retreat with the Hartford and other insurance companies in upstate New York in which they decided to redefine this period around leisure, graying as playing. And that idea started to get traction, and it finally took off with the emergence of retirement communities at the end of the 1950s. A guy by the name of Del Webb was essentially a life stage entrepreneur who invented the golden years. He coined that phrase. He built the first large-scale retirement community built around golf and leisure. And it caught on. It was a remarkable achievement. There was a tense moment, though, the night before the first big retirement community in America was set to open, Sun City. Webb and his lieutenants were sitting around a table in a Mexican restaurant outside of Phoenix, and in a dreadful former cotton field, dusty and hot. And the guy who was in charge of mortgages said, how am I ever going to sell a 30-year mortgage to somebody who's 65 years old? And they realized, oh my God, we should have thought about that before investing the $2 million in 1950s dollars in it. And they went home and they tossed and turned, and the next morning 100,000 people showed up. There was a traffic jam for 22 miles leading into what was to become Sun City. And this notion of the golden years became a centerpiece of the American dream. Instead of being a push of people out of the labor force, it became a pull. This thing that people struggled to get to as quickly as possible. The success wasn't retiring at 65, it was retiring at 60 or 58. And it's not just in later life that we've invented these new stages of life. The second adolescence that became the golden years, the first adolescence was actually invented by a 60-year-old in 1904 in America, a guy by the name of G. Stanley Hall. And again, it was because we had all these neither-nors, these young people who were children, they weren't adults. We were worried they had physical maturity, emotional immaturity, that they were going to cause great social disruption. So we created this moratorium period. It took 40 years. We invented the phrase teenager. And it turns out that the guy who invented adolescence, G. Stanley Hall, was the first person to propose a new stage of life between midlife and old age that wasn't just a pale imitation of adolescence. Hall, 20 years after he wrote this great book coining the adolescence phrase, said, "I made a big mistake. I shouldn't have invented teenagers. I should have invented this new stage of life." And he described it beautifully as an Indian summer. And he said human beings didn't reach the height of their capacity until the shadows started slanting eastward, which I thought such a beautiful phrase. And I think now with these vast numbers, thousands of people a day flooding into their 60s, with the unsustainability of the current model, right, does it make any sense at a time when half the children born in the developed world are projected to see their 100th birthday to load up all of our education at the beginning of life, work like maniacs for 30 years, and then have this balloon payment of 30 or 40 years of leisure that we can't afford individually, that as societies we can't sustain, vast dependency ratios? Who wants to be an oxymoron for a period that could be as long as midlife in duration? So there are a lot of reasons to rethink things, but I think the best reason of all is there's an incredible windfall of talent in this group. Just think 30, 40 years ago, we had a similar windfall. Millions of women moved into new productive roles in society, and then as now, we thought it was going to be a zero-sum proposition, that they were going to displace men, there was going to be a lot of conflict and pain, and we were going to end up in the same place as we started. Now we know there's no way we could be anywhere near globally competitive without that extraordinarily important workforce. And I think the same is going to be true of this group, and even more uplifting in the States, and I know to a certain extent here already, there's a movement of people who not only want to have second acts, but who want to have second acts that have deep personal meaning, that provide continued means and economic security, and that mean something beyond themselves, that provide passion, purpose, as we heard even in the last talk about passion and purpose, and a paycheck. In America, we call that an Encore career, and 9 million people have already moved into these Encore careers in the States. 31 million more in the second half of life give it a top priority, but are struggling with the transition, how to get from what's last to what's next, how to finance that shift, how to go from aspiration to action. I think if we tap this vast source of talent, we can, I think, turn that paradox of longevity into the payoff that it should be. Instead of being good for individuals, bad for the society, it can be a vast payoff now as the boomers move into this period, but for generations to come. And I think it can be a great source of innovation, not just the subject of innovation, because I think the design of this stage is one of the great innovation opportunities of the coming century. But I think the population moving into this period is one of the greatest source of potential innovators. For the last 11 years, every study of entrepreneurship in the United States has shown that the over 50 group is the most entrepreneurial. There's an economist at the University of Chicago, David Galenson, who studied creativity in the arts and has found over the past century that the two most creative groups, the two great sources of genius, are young people who tend to be conceptual geniuses and older people who are experimental geniuses. Malcolm Gladwell's written about this, and he uses the example of Fleetwood Mac and the Eagles to illustrate this case. So the Eagles have 3 greatest hits albums by the time they're 24. Fleetwood Mac fails in 7 different incarnations. They try to be an English blues band. They have gray hair and kids graduating from high school before they reel off Rumors and 3 of the greatest selling rock albums to that point in history. So I think that there's not just the conventional benefits of experience, but some surprises that await us as well. And I've seen that, and I'll close by telling this story through the Purpose Prize, which is a prize for social entrepreneurs in the second half of life. When we initially launched the prize, giving out 5 of these each year, we thought we'd be lucky to be able to find 5 good winners. The first year we got 1,200 nominations. Now we've had almost 10,000 since we've launched the prize. And some of them are people who've had distinguished midlife careers. A guy I met with recently who had run CBS News described himself as a member of the PIP squad. And when I asked him about what that means, he said, previously important persons. And he said that their motto is, the world may be done with us, it's just we're not done with the world. But many of the winners of the Purpose Prize could have been members of the Pop Squad, previously ordinary people. These kinds of people who were late bloomers, who did their greatest work at a time when they're supposedly over the hill. And I'll close by just telling the story of one of my favorite, a member of the Pop Squad for sure, Robert Chambers, a college dropout, a Vietnam vet, who'd been in the banking business but in low and middle level jobs, and whose goal in life was the golden years. He wanted to retire to New Hampshire, to northern New England, and ride his cycle. And after 2 years of doing that, he discovered, much to his dismay, that he had run out of money. He started looking for a job, faced age discrimination. The only role he could get was at a used car dealership that specialized in taking advantage of low-income rural buyers, what they called the woodchucks. They'd have training seminars on how to take advantage of these low-income rural individuals. And he saw it happen over and over again. One day, a guy bought a car that had maybe 6 months or a year left in it, a 5-year loan at 15%, driving off with smoke belching out of the tailpipe, and Chambers was standing at the front door of the agency and realizing that this was a tragedy. When that car died, he would not be able to buy another car because of his loan. He wouldn't be able to work. His family would suffer. His community would suffer. And as he was thinking about this, he heard a slapping sound, and he turned around, and the sales manager and the finance manager were high-fiving to celebrate this profit that they'd made off of this guy. And Chambers decided he had to do something about it, so he started taking long bike rides, and he came up with this idea to create an agency that provided fuel-efficient new cars, low-interest loans, and credit counseling to low-income rural buyers. And he called it Bonnie Clack for car loans and counseling. And the reason he called it Clack was because there's a popular radio show in America about cars called Car Talk. And the hosts, their nicknames are Click and Clack. So he honored Click and Clack. And he eventually grew this program to 8 states and got invited to the White House as this great example of social innovation, an example that social innovation, that genius, that entrepreneurship are hardly the exclusive province of young people. And when President Obama called him up to the stage, he uttered one line that is stuck in my mind ever since. He said, "I was old enough to know injustice when I saw it and experienced enough to do something about it." And I said to Robert, "Wow, that's absolutely wonderful. What a beautiful line. That must have been the highlight of your life." He said, "Oh, no. I got interviewed the next week on Car Talk." Thank you.